Two U.S. destroyers pushed into the Strait of Hormuz as Washington said the move was meant to begin setting conditions for mine clearing and a new safe passage for commercial shipping. Iran had already confirmed mines in the strait. At the same time, U.S. and Iranian talks ended without a deal, leaving the ceasefire under visible strain. That is what makes this moment more dangerous than it first appears. This is not just a transit, it is a test of whether the world's most critical oil choke point can be reopened without the next phase of the crisis starting at sea. Why send warships in before the danger is fully removed? Because the waterway itself has become the front line. Critical energy choke points on the planet. According to the available reports, around a fifth of the world's traded oil normally moves through it, with more than 100 ships a day using the passage before the crisis. That is why Iran's closure of the strait became one of Tehran's strongest strategic levers in the war. At the same time, the political track has not stabilized the situation. U.S. and Iranian talks in Islamabad ended without an agreement, and AP reported that the failure left uncertainty over a fragile two-week ceasefire. So the military problem and the diplomatic problem are now running in parallel. That is the immediate backdrop for the U.S. naval move. Reuters said 2 American warships crossed the strait as part of a plan to begin removing mines. USNI, citing Central Command, reported that the transit was meant to start setting conditions for mine clearing and for a new safe passage that could later be shared with commercial shipping. USNI also reported that Iran had already acknowledged mines in the strait and outlined routes ships could use to avoid them. What makes this moment unusual is simple. The waterway is not just threatened, it is being actively contested while diplomacy remains unresolved. That turns a mine-clearing mission into something much larger than routine naval traffic. The first clear move came from the U.S. military. On Saturday, 2 American guided missile destroyers entered the Strait of Hormuz and crossed the waterway as part of what Central Command described as the opening phase of mine clearing. Reuters reported that the stated purpose was to begin removing mines from one of the most critical routes in global trade. USNI added that this was the first transit by American warships through the strait since the U.S.-Israel offensive against Iran began on February 28. That point matters because it means the operation was not presented as routine naval movement. It was presented as the first physical step toward reopening a passage that had already been turned into a strategic pressure point. The ships were not there just to show presence. They were there to change conditions at sea. The initial official message from Washington was carefully framed but still revealing. According to the available reports, CENTCOM said the transit was meant to begin setting conditions for clearing mines. USNI reported that Admiral Brad Cooper described the effort as the start of establishing a new passage that could later be shared with the maritime industry to restore the flow of commerce. That gave the first U.S. explanation of what this mission was trying to do. It was not only about military freedom of movement, it was also about creating a usable route for commercial shipping after Iran acknowledged there were mines in the strait and laid out paths that ships could use to avoid them. In other words, the first U.S. response was both military and economic at the same time. That is the clearest common point across reports. The first reaction around that move showed why the situation was already unstable. AP reported that during the ceasefire talks, the U.S. military said the 2 destroyers had transited the waterway ahead of mine-clearing work, calling it a first since the war began. But AP also noted that Iranian state media said the country's Joint Military Command denied that account. At the same time, the diplomatic channel produced no agreement, leaving uncertainty over what AP described as a fragile 2-week ceasefire. So from the very first stage, the crisis moved on 2 tracks at once. One track was naval access, the other was political failure. What changed first was simple. The U.S. moved from warning about the strait to acting inside it, while the broader ceasefire remained unresolved. What changed next was the scale of the mission. It no longer looked like a single transit through dangerous water. USNI reported that after entering the strait, the two destroyers operated in the Persian Gulf and then moved back through the passage toward the Gulf of Oman. The same report said additional U.S. forces were involved, including underwater drones, while Central Command described the effort as the start of a new passage that would later be shared with the maritime industry. That is a significant shift. The operation moved from symbolic access to the first outline of a managed corridor. It suggested that Washington was not just proving it could enter the strait, it was trying to shape how traffic might return. But the sea lanes did not suddenly reopen in any normal sense. USNI reported that traffic through Hormuz was still only trickling through despite the ceasefire. Lloyd's List Intelligence tracked 6 transits on Wednesday and 8 on Thursday, while Tuesday, the day of President Donald Trump's deadline to open the strait, saw 15. Even that remained far below the usual flow, with USNI saying traffic was still less than 10% of normal daily levels. The same report cited estimates that roughly 500 to 700 vessels over 10,000 deadweight tons were stuck in the Persian Gulf, with more when smaller ships were counted. So the next development was not stability. It was proof that clearing a waterway and restoring confidence were two different battles. At the same time, the political track weakened instead of reinforcing the naval move. AP reported that the U.S. and Iran ended face-to-face talks without an agreement, leaving uncertainty over what it described as a fragile 2-week ceasefire. During those talks, AP said the U.S. military announced that 2 destroyers had transited the strait ahead of mine-clearing work, while Iranian state media said the country's joint military command denied that account. That matters because the dispute was no longer only about access or security. It was also about whose version of events would define the crisis. What changed next was the information environment itself. Even the meaning of the U.S. move became contested. Then the language hardened further. AP reported that Trump said he had instructed the Navy to seek and interdict vessels in international waters that had paid a toll to Iran. USNI, meanwhile, noted that how the United States would fully clear the strait remained an open question, even as mine countermeasure assets and expeditionary capabilities existed in the broader force. That combination is what pushed the story into a more serious phase. The U.S. was no longer just entering a mined choke point. It was moving toward enforcement while the method, the risk, and the diplomatic outcome all remained unsettled. The turning point came when the mission stopped looking like a limited naval opening move and started looking like the first stage of direct control over the strait. Up to that point, the U.S. case had been framed around mine clearing and the creation of a safe pathway for commercial traffic. Reuters described the destroyer transit as part of a plan to start removing mines. USNI reported that Central Command presented it as the beginning of a new passage that would later be shared with the maritime industry. But AP then reported a much sharper political signal. After talks with Iran ended without agreement, President Donald Trump said the U.S. Navy would begin a blockade to stop ships from entering or leaving the Strait of Hormuz. He also said the Navy had been instructed to seek and interdict vessels in international waters that had paid a toll to Iran. That changed the meaning of the naval move. It was no longer only about reopening a route. It now pointed toward enforcing the terms of access. That matters because USNI had already reported that one of the Iranian routes around the mines involved ships passing by Larak Island, and in some cases, dealing with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps for documentation and payment. So, once Washington signaled interdiction of vessels that had paid Iran, the issue moved beyond mine danger alone. The central question became, who would control the rules of movement through the choke point while the ceasefire remained fragile? AP also reported that Iran's state media said the country's joint military command denied the U.S. account of the destroyer transit ahead of mine clearing. That denial did not erase the U.S. move, but it showed that even the operational facts were being folded into a struggle over legitimacy and leverage. This was the break in the story. The fight was no longer just over safe passage, it was over authority. What makes this a true pivot is that the practical side remained unresolved, even as the political language escalated. USNI said additional U.S. forces, including underwater drones, were involved, but also noted that how the United States would fully clear the strait remained an open question. At the same time, shipping was still moving at a fraction of normal volume, with hundreds of vessels still stuck in the Gulf. Based on what has been confirmed so far, that is the clearest sign that the crisis had entered a different phase. The United States had moved from transit to corridor building to the threat of maritime enforcement, while the water itself was still not fully secured. Based on what has been confirmed so far, this episode matters because it shows how a narrow waterway can become a military pressure point without a major fleet battle. Reuters reported that the U.S. sent 2 warships through the Strait of Hormuz to begin setting conditions for mine clearing. AP reported that before the war, the strait carried about 20% of global oil supplies. Put those 2 facts together, and the meaning is clear. A mine threat in Hormuz is not just a local naval hazard. It can turn maritime access itself into a strategic weapon. This is why the U.S. move matters to naval warfare. It is not only about escorts or deterrence. It is about reopening a choke point after that choke point has already been used for leverage. The second military lesson is about how modern sea control now works. USNI reported that the destroyers were supported by additional U.S. forces, including underwater drones, and that Central Command described the effort as the start of a new safe passage for shipping. But USNI also said how the United States would fully clear the strait remained an open question. That matters because it shows the mission is not simply transit and not yet a fully restored sea lane. It is corridor building under risk. In modern naval operations, that is a different kind of contest. It mixes warships, unmanned systems, mine countermeasures, and traffic management into one operation. The battlefield is no longer only where ships fight. It is where ships can move, where they are allowed to move, and who can make that movement look credible to the shipping industry. The third strategic point is that physical access and political authority are now merging. USNI reported that one Iranian route involved vessels passing Larak Island and contacting the IRGC for documentation and sometimes payment. AP then reported that Trump threatened to interdict vessels that had paid a toll to Iran, while also threatening a blockade after talks failed. At the same time, USNI said transits were still under 10% of normal daily flow, with hundreds of vessels stuck in the Gulf. That suggests the real contest is no longer only about removing mines. It is about who sets the rules of passage after the danger is reduced. And that is why this crisis reaches beyond one transit. It touches naval power, maritime law, coercion, and the credibility of sea access itself.